What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another episode of Faith Unaltered and Real Seekers. We're doing a Faith Unaltered and Real Seekers collab today, and we're talking about the thesis, the discussion topic at hand: can God lie? Now, apparently, there have been some concession happening in the background, and so this is going to go a little bit different today than I had originally thought. But Phil and Dell have been talking in the email chain that we've been a part of, and so I'm going to let them both explain what has kind of taken place in that discussion, as well as give you guys an awesome episode today. So don't forget to subscribe if you haven't yet to both Faith Unaltered and Real Seekers. If you would like to donate and financially support our ministries, you can do both now, since Dell has officially reached 1,000 subscribers. Hit that little dollar sign below the video. You can send us super chats, super thanks, super like, or super chat, super sticker, super thanks, or you can always donate to Faith Unaltered via PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App to help us financially keep the channel running. And so we appreciate it, and we welcome both Dell and Phil to the show. Thank you guys for joining us. Dale, I will turn it over to you to intro yourself and tell us a little bit about what has transpired between you and Phil over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, so I met Phil on your show. We were talking about Calvinism and our issues with that, and it was on that show that Phil mentioned this great idea that sounded like a lot of fun, because I don't think I've seen any debates about this and stuff really online. So we asked this question: is it logically possible for God to lie? And in the process of my preparing for my opening speech, I kind of came to the realization that, at least given my presuppositions of how free will works, the grounding of the categorical ability, that actually I'm compelled to agree with Phil. And he's right. It looks like I was wrong, that it is not logically possible for God to lie. And I'll explain a little bit more about why that is in my presentation.
Right on, right on. And I know you've got slides and things like that you want to go over before we get into that. Phil, welcome back. It's a pleasure to have you on, and I'm excited. Man, I can't even talk. I'm excited to participate in this discussion with you guys today. So, how have you been doing since the last time you've been on?
Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
There you go.
I've been doing great. I actually was on a long road trip with my wife when a lot of these emails became, started flying back and forth through the internet air. But went down to visit my my in-laws in Carlsbad, New Mexico. But before that, we went out to Iowa for a retreat with some people that I've been associated with all my life, some pretty dear friends and everything. So we had an extremely meaningful trip, and it was I just can't describe just how much it meant to me to be able to go to both Iowa and then to go down and visit Lori's parents. It was a treat. That's just the only way I can say it. It was a treat. So I'm doing great. I feel refreshed after that trip, and that's when partly when some of these, when we exchange some of these emails. So doing great. Excited to be a part of this today. I think it's a very, very important discussion. It has vast implications for all sorts of theological issues and theological doctrines and so on. So this is good.
Right on. Well, we appreciate you being here, Phil. I'm glad that you had a good trip, and glad you're feeling refreshed. And so I always love holidays and times to get out. We don't really go anywhere like significant. Next year, I want to go to Florida to be with my dad. That would be really cool, I think, to spend the holidays down there with him. But definitely know what it's like to get back and feel refreshed from that. So we appreciate you being here, Dell. We appreciate you being here as well. But Dell, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you, and we can get this conversation rolling, brother. So let's go.
Cool. All right, cool. So yeah, I'm going to be presenting the slides, and I'll identify the part where I kind of changed my mind. But it's important to note this discussion still matters because I still have some qualms about my new understanding of God's moral nature determining his choices. So
Mhm.
let me just bring up the issues. I've never done this as a non-host. Okay, share screen. It's the same process.
Yeah, it should be. I'll just add it once I see it down here.
Okay,
There we go.
that's showing up. Okay. Okay, cool.
Perfect.
So is it logically possible for God to lie? Can he lie? My original intention was to argue yes, but no. Okay, so the first thing to understand is we have to get what are the biblical parameters, because any philosophical or theological speculation as a true Bible believing Christian has to be consistent with the Bible. So the first thing to note is that there are extended cases of God perhaps using lying, at least, right? So, for example, in 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 19 to 23, we're told that God used a lying spirit. So God himself didn't lie, but he knowingly used a spirit that would tell King Ahab a lie, and he knew that would successfully deceive him. So from this text, we are able to see God is able to use lies for the greater good, and that's not a moral imperfection or morally questionable in any way. Also, in terms of his power or omnipotence, we learn in Jeremiah 32, verses 17 and 27, that, look, Lord God, behold, you have made the heavens and the earth and everything therein. I added that. By your great power and your outstretched arm, nothing is too difficult for you. Nothing will be impossible for God. That's what we learn in Luke. So this is obviously going to start to raise certain issues, right? Because, well, obviously human beings, we have the power to tell a lie. We can express propositions that do not correspond to reality. And if we're going to say God can't lie, the immediate superficial, at face value, it seems like we're saying we can do something God can't. So that's another element that we need to throw into our understanding here. There's also an issue, well, can God indirectly or implicitly deceive or tell a lie? And again, I think the Bible does say, yeah, in a way, because in Genesis 3, right after the fall of man, Adam and Eve, they realize they're naked, they're hiding from God because they're embarrassed. And, God asks them this question, hey, Adam and Eve, where are you? Well, was God truly ignorant? No, we know that he's omniscient. So he knew the whole time. And in a way, he's asking this disingenuous question. He's kind of playing a little game. Again, for a greater good purpose. This is not immoral on his part. Nobody has a problem. But yeah, God can tell what I call indirect or implicit lies, at least, for a good purpose. Now, we also have on the other side these clear verses that explicitly state, look, God is not a man that he should lie. He's not a human being that he should change his mind. And later on, we say in the New Testament, in Hebrews, God, determining to show more abundantly to heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things that immutable means that can't be changed, in which it is impossible for God to lie. Okay, so this is an explicit. When it comes to directly telling a lie, we hear that it's impossible in some sense. Why is it impossible? Because it would create two immutable things that would create a logical contradiction. So this is the raw biblical data we have to make sense of. So it's important to note that there are some lessons here, right? So biblically speaking, God's not lying is always contextually bound up with the fulfillment of his promises, his prophecies, his ultimate purposes with respect to his covenants. I didn't write it. I didn't have time to put it down, but I think J.I. Packer writes down about 5 specific senses in the Bible in which God is said to be immutable. So this does not necessarily translate to God being immutable in the, in general, like he's totally changeless. In fact, I disagree with that because I take William Lane Craig's belief that God is temporal at this moment. And so there are certain lateral changes that God goes through. But so when the Bible speaks of God being changeless, it's with certain respects. Specifically, when he makes a promise, it will be fulfilled. He will never renege on a promise. He will fulfill his prophecies. He will fulfill his covenant and stuff like that. And it's the same with his promise not to lie. It doesn't necessarily say that God wouldn't lie about who won the Super Bowl or something like that. Secondly, there is no explanation given for the relevant difference between God and man with respect to their lying. So the Bible just doesn't tell us. Is it something that's internal or essential to the kind of being that God is versus human beings, ontologically speaking, or is it based on some kind of contingent, either externally or internally, some kind of extrinsic difference that's contingent? It's not essential to the kind of being they are. Also, we have this issue, nothing will be impossible for God. So no thing. I'm taking states of affairs to be things here, that having the power to actualize a state of affairs, such as expressing a proposition that does not correspond to reality. Is this impossible for God given his omnipotence or not? It just depends on, is actualizing a state of affairs where a proposition is actualized that doesn't correspond to reality. Is that a thing or not for God to do or not be able to do? Okay, I already said that. And also the Bible doesn't specify, when it says it's impossible for God to lie, it doesn't specify, is it logically impossible for God to lie? Is it just metaphysically impossible for God to lie? Or is it even lower? Is it only factually, given the external facts, it's impossible for God to lie? I don't think the Bible specifies that. It's not a philosophy textbook. It's not thinking about that. So we just have to be aware. Okay. So cool. So looking at the philosophy then, the possibility of a morally perfect being sinning or lying. So the main way many Christians and philosophers argue that it's logically impossible for a morally perfect being like God to sin by telling a lie is through an appeal to logical contradiction, right? We saw that in Hebrews a bit, where there's these two things about God, and these create a logical contradiction. So if God could tell a lie, it's kind of like saying, well, it's logically possible for a morally perfect being to be not morally perfect. And therein is the obvious explicit contradiction that arises. But I think it's important to note that, look, there are other ways of understanding this that seem plausible to my mind. So in the first place, there are examples of beings who, at least at certain times, were morally perfect in the sense of being sinless. Adam and Eve, up until Genesis 3, you could say they were morally perfect. They'd never sinned. They were totally sinless, just like God is. And yet it was still logically possible for them at each and every moment up until Genesis 3 to have sinned. They could have told a lie if they wanted to, right? It wasn't like it was logically necessary that at the moment of the fall, they chose to sin and fall. No, they could have done that 2 minutes earlier or 5 hours earlier or 2 days earlier, right? At every step along the way, there was always a logical possibility for these morally perfect or sinless beings to tell a lie or to sin in some way. So this kind of establishes some kind of plausibility. There's also, you might dismiss that and say, yeah, but Adam and Eve, they're ultimately sinners. They were destined to sin and stuff. So that the world as a whole, they had to sin in some way. Okay, well, let's look at the angel Gabriel. There are certain angels that are totally sinless and will eternally be sinless for the rest of their lives. They will, for the rest of eternity, they will never choose to sin. They didn't choose to sin in the fall with Lucifer and his angels that became demons. And as far as biblical revelation says, yeah, the angel Gabriel will never choose to sin in the future. So he is eternally, from the moment of his creation, eternally sinless or morally perfect. And yet it's obviously false to say that it's logically impossible that the angel Gabriel could ever sin. No, obviously, from Lucifer's example, these angels did have the free will ability to choose to sin or lie or rebel against God and stuff like that. Um, okay, so the main difference here, I guess, that I think Phil's going to be arguing is that, well, there's a fundamental difference between these beings, angels and stuff. Sure, they were morally perfect or rather sinless, but it was kind of a contingent sinlessness. Whereas with God, he is morally perfect and sinless by essence or by nature. That's where the impossibility stems from. And on that front, there may be a difference between the property of moral perfection, something that's an incommunicable property to human beings, versus the mere property of just merely being sinless. That's a contingent property, it's communicable and stuff like that. So, okay, great. If that's so, then we have to find out, well, what do we mean by moral perfection? What does that property entail? Does it entail the logical impossibility, or might it just entail the metaphysical impossibility? So that's what we have to kind of understand, this property of moral perfection being different than just mere sinlessness. Okay, so in terms of libertarian free will, I think that the God of the Bible is clearly presented as being what philosophers call a libertarian free will agent. So the clearest example of this is the issue of creation. Look, God freely chose to create the universe. He could have chosen to refrain from creating the universe. Obviously, we know this because God exists as a logically necessary being. So there are worlds where God just creates nothing at all. He exists alone, kind of thing. Totally ase, and he exists alone. That's logically possible. And then there's also, possible worlds where God creates various universes, including the actual universe that we live in. So this is what philosophers call a clear categorical ability, right? God had a categorical ability to either create our actual universe, but it's logically possible he could have refrained from willing to create our universe as well. Our universe is not logically necessary, as though God is kind of dependent. He has to create us. He didn't have a choice. No, I think the clear Bible, what the Bible is saying is that he did have free will here in a libertarian way. He had a categorical or dual ability to do or not to do, kind of thing. And in fact, many Christian philosophers and theologians have argued that this categorical or dual ability aspect of free will is a necessary prerequisite for one to be considered a moral agent as well. So kind of turning it to this question of morality, which is relevant to our topic about can God lie? And there is this issue in the philosophy books, just looking at a human level. It's almost said the difference between making a moral praiseworthy choice, choosing not to lie, tell the truth, versus being morally blameworthy. I choose to lie. Well, I incur blame. That distinction only makes sense in light of us having a categorical ability to do or to do otherwise, and us having the control to distinguish between those two choices. And this is a fundamental thing. This is one of the main reasons I always felt the need to answer yes. God must be at least logically. It's logically possible for God to lie, so that in a sense he can be morally praiseworthy for not making that choice. And I would restrict him and just say that it's only metaphysically impossible that God will lie. He will never make that choice, kind of thing, right? But yeah, the point here is that the moral praiseworthiness versus moral blameworthiness is contingent on having this categorical ability. And if we're saying that God is just morally determined by his nature, his morally perfect nature, by essence, he just can't lie. It's logically impossible. Well, in what sense is God morally praiseworthy any more than a chicken doing what it does or something like that? I mean, if you're just determined to do what you do, it seems to diminish the moral praiseworthiness of God. So that was one of the reasons. Uh, okay, so I'll just read this. So the very concept of one's being morally praiseworthy. Okay, so I said that. So yeah, I think that's in a sense my first major objection. So I'll just go over that. Okay, so here's the slide where I kind of realized I changed my mind, because there is Tyler Vela and Calvinists and stuff like that. They'll raise this, what's called the grounding objection. How do you ground this categorical ability? And my obvious answer was, well, in logically possible worlds, right? There's maybe a logical possible world where God has the categorical ability to tell a lie, but there is no metaphysical or feasible possible world where he can actually do so. And with respect to humans, the way I ground the categorical ability in those logical possible worlds is I say, okay, so there's the actual world where I as a human being choose to lie, right? And that contrasts with a identical logically possible world. Everything up to that moment, at least, is exactly the same as the actual world. All of the external circumstances and influences, as well as all of my intrinsic properties, my nature, my beliefs, my desires, whatever a compatibilist would want, those are all the same. The only difference is that I and my faculty of my will actually exists in this world versus only exists in potential form in that other world. And that's what makes the difference. It's just, given that I actually exist, I would never use my will to choose to lie or to do the opposite of whatever I choose to do in the actual world. So it's the difference between actually existing with a will versus just potentially existing with a will. And that's what allows me to say, yeah, we have this categorical ability grounded in logically possible worlds where I make a different choice. Now, here's where applying that to God, I realize that just makes no sense whatsoever, because there are no logically possible worlds where God doesn't actually exist, or his will. The faculty of his will doesn't actually exist. He exists in all logically possible worlds because, as Phil's going to say, in a way, he transcends them. He's the one that grounds all the logically possible worlds. They're grounded in his causal potential. So this is why I just, given my certain assumptions, I have to be wrong. There is no logically possible world where God doesn't exist with his will. He actually exists in all of them. So because of that, and because once he actually exists with his will, he will never metaphysically choose to tell a lie. That means there is no logical possible world where he will ever choose to tell a lie. God must be morally determined. There must be some other explanation as to why he never chooses to lie or to tell a sin. And I guess the best we have is that, well, I guess he's morally determined by his morally perfect nature and essence and stuff. So, okay, here's one other objection that I would like to talk about with Phil, and I hope this isn't going on too long and stuff, but there's also this issue of the temptation of Jesus. So once Jesus became incarnate, the Bible tells us that, so in Hebrews 2:17, right, it says, therefore he had to be made human in every respect so that he might become merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God in order to make propitiation for the sins of his people. And obviously, I kind of outlined at the beginning, humans, we do have the categorical ability to tell untruths. So you might ask, well, was Jesus really human? When the Gospels talk about him being tempted, if he was truly in his divine nature determined, fully determined to never lie or to never sin, is this really a genuine temptation? I don't know that it's the same kind of temptation that I face, where I actually do have a possibility, or a logical possibility at least, to create a sin and to actually carry out this sin. Maybe he could face temptations as a temporary desire, but again, it's diminished if there's no actual possibility in any sense for him to bring that temptation to fruition. It seems to detract again from the moral praiseworthiness and reality of Jesus's temptation. So that's kind of my second qualm. If we're going to say that, yeah, God is just morally determined by his nature, was he truly genuinely tempted? And how can God be said to be morally praiseworthy? So yeah, that's my presentation in a nutshell, and I'll go back to the screen.
All right, Dale, I'm going to leave the slides up. Well,
Oh,
never mind.
okay. Sorry,
If,
you want me to
I was going to say, yeah, if you would leave the slides back up in case Phil wants to like go back and hit on any particular slide. But Phil, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you with your response.
Yeah, definitely. I see a lot of things that I think we could explore and address. I don't think we can probably cover all of them. I don't think we're going to have, I think we would have to have another 4-hour marathon if we were going to cover all of them. So,
Marathon.
well, maybe we should try to break our record. I don't know, but yeah, definitely put up the slides again, because I have a few things that I think we could explore on I think on all of those slides.
Okay.
And yeah. So first of all, in the case of King Ahab, I discussed this in my book, Calvin's Desperation, and the book is about Calvinism. And to give you a little background, in Calvinism, God determines all things. If he determines all things, then he determines all of our beliefs. If he determines all of our beliefs, he determines all of our false beliefs. And if he determines our false beliefs, then that means that he is in the business of deception. And I argue in the book that deception and lying are morally equivalent. So if God deceives human beings by determining their false beliefs, then God is a deceiver. And if he is a deceiver, that is no better than being a liar. And then I list a great many verses in the Bible where deceit is always presented in a bad light, basically. That deceit is never looked upon favorably in Scripture. It's always considered a moral defect. And so if God deceives, then God is morally defective. And that is incompatible with the idea that God has a morally perfect nature and cannot be morally defective, and cannot do anything that's morally defective. And so whenever I present this argument that God cannot be a deceiver, my Calvinist friends will constantly bring up King Ahab and say, well, God is actually in the deception business because he sent the deceiving spirit or a lying spirit to deceive King Ahab and to go ahead and attack Ramoth Gilead and be crushed and die, and the whole thing falls apart. And so they cite this as an example of God determining King Ahab to hold a false belief, because the false belief that the lying spirit deceived him into believing was that he was going to be victorious in that battle. And so that was the lie that God allowed King Ahab to believe. And he sent that lying spirit knowing that that lying spirit would deceive Ahab into believing that. And so my response to that is that this case of King Ahab is not a case where God is determining someone to have a false belief, because it is not God who is directly using his divine power and will to manipulate King Ahab's mind into believing a lie. In fact, there is an intermediate agent in this case, the lying spirit. And the lying spirit comes up. If you read that passage in 1 Kings 22, if you read that passage, you will see that there is this conversation kind of, between God. God is going to say, who's going to go and deceive King Ahab? And this lying spirit kind of comes forward and kind of volunteers, says, I'll go deceive him. And God says, well, okay, by what means are you going to deceive him? And so that is a clear case of God allowing a certain means to deceive King Ahab. And what I point out in the book, and I think this is extremely important, is that this was not a case where King Ahab could not have done otherwise. This was a freedom permitting circumstance as far as King Ahab is concerned. And so that means that King Ahab was not determined to hold a false belief in this case. So for the Calvinists to argue that 1 Kings 22 is support for the fact that God can be deceitful, or that God can actually effectively lie, it's not a valid point. It's not a valid support for God being a deity of deception.
And I'll just chime in here. I agree 100% with everything you just said. I think this is not a determined thing, and God is not morally responsible. He did not determine this. So yeah, what you said, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. But there are a lot of people who don't have that background, and I wanted to make sure that we cover that,
Cool.
because under indeterminism, means and secondary causes are a logical possibility, but under determinism, means and secondary causes are off the table. They're completely out of the radar. And then I also want to just reiterate the fact that this was a freedom permitting circumstance, and there's nothing in that scripture to indicate that it wasn't. So King Ahab did not have to believe the lying spirit. He could have done otherwise. He could have rejected the lying spirit, but he wanted to go to battle. And so it was a matter of King Ahab not falling into line and not being not submitting to God's will, So if that's the case, then you're right. This is not a situation where God is actually deceiving anyone. But the other thing that I wanted to mention was that in Jeremiah, it says nothing is too difficult for you. And then Luke 1 says nothing will be impossible with God. That seems to fly in the face of Hebrews 6:18, where it says that it is impossible for God to lie. So nothing will be impossible for God, but it's impossible for God to lie. Well, that just says that there's something that's impossible with God, where we just got through reading Luke 1:37. It says nothing is impossible for God. So is that a contradiction? And I have always considered that there are two ways in which something can be impossible. And you mentioned this already, Dale. And I think you kind of alluded to the possibility that there could be other ways that something could be impossible, but I've only ever really considered two. There may be more, and I might have a little bit of a tunnel vision here, but I've always thought that the way to resolve this conflict, or to resolve this problem, is to say that it's logically impossible for God to lie, but it is not metaphysically impossible for God to do anything. There's nothing that is metaphysically impossible for him, because that speaks to his omnipotence. And so there is no conflict here as long as we differentiate between two ways of something being impossible. And so what I'm kind of doing is I'm kind of underlining and underscoring and propping up what you've said here, Dale. I think that's where. For me, the idea that God could lie and the fact that it's impossible for God to lie, I think it seems to me that that's in the same category as that God cannot make a married bachelor, or that he can't draw a two-sided triangle. Because a married bachelor is a logical contradiction, a logical impossibility. A two-sided triangle is a logical impossibility. And so I think it's even though the scripture doesn't differentiate between two kinds of something being impossible, I think it's pretty much a matter of common sense and just I think it's just kind of implicit in the fact that people should understand that the Bible makes it clear that God has a morally perfect nature, and that so therefore for God to sin is the same as a married bachelor or a two-sided triangle, because a sinless God can't sin. A God that does not have a sin nature, that has a morally perfect nature, cannot sin, because what you're doing is you are actually contradicting the original proposition that God has a morally perfect nature. Because as soon as you say God lies or God could lie, then that means that it is within God's nature to lie. And this is something else that I've always argued for, and I'm not absolutely sure about this. I could be wrong about this. But I've always thought that in order for any being to make a certain choice and a certain action, that choice and action must be within the nature of that being, or that choice and action would never occur. And so that's kind of partly what I think about when I think of can a morally perfect God actually do something that's morally imperfect? If he does something that's morally imperfect, it must be within his nature to do that. And we just got through saying that it's not. So that's where the logical contradiction comes, in my mind. And that's what I was going to argue for. But Dale, you've pretty much already covered it. And I think that's, I think that's kind of the fundamental way of understanding this. In my view, again, I could be wrong. It's happened before, and I know that's a shocking realization. But I've been wrong before, and I could be wrong about this, and I could be wrong about the idea that there are only two kinds of impossibility.
Yeah.
And when I read your slides, it occurred to me that I've always thought of only two kinds of impossibility before, and Dale has just brought up another one, and so that got me thinking, and that's just another example of, if Phil, you're not right about everything, there are things that you haven't thought about, and that's why we need each other in the body of Christ, so
yeah.
You've got a slide up here. Did someone want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I do want to jump in here for just a second, and because there was something I was reading out of the Septuagint, but I've got the New King James, but they both say the same thing, so it's really relevant. But I just wanted to ask both of you, because y'all seem to be both on the same page whenever it comes to this act, whenever God sends this lying, deceiving spirit to Ahab, in the sense that Ahab still had the freedom to reject this, that, and the other. And so my question is just simply, and let me just read this real quick to get context for everybody, and I'll play devil's advocate for just a minute. But so in verse 19 of 2 Kings 20, or 1 Kings 22, it says, "Then Micaiah said, 'Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by, on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will persuade Ahab to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth Gilead?' So one spoke in this manner, and another spoke in that manner. Then the Spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I will persuade him. The Lord said to him, In what way? So he said, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And the Lord said, You shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so. Therefore, look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster against you. And so here's my question at this point of the conversation, anyway. Given this little phrase right here, you shall persuade him and also prevail, does that take this topic like kind of, I don't want to say that this is determinism, but I'll act like the Calvinist and say this is clearly showing that there is no categorical ability for Ahab to reject, or like he is destined to be prevailed over by this lying spirit. Does that change up things for you guys? Because it sounded like the foundation of both of y'all's arguments was the fact that determinism is not true in any way, shape, or form. And so if this event was determined, would that like kind of throw a wrench into what you guys are saying? Or even if it is determined, would it not? And Dale, if you want to answer that, and then we'll go to Phil, or however you guys want to do it. I'm just curious.
So absolutely, if the Calvinist is right that King Ahab's deception was determined, God is at fault. That this is an immoral God, and I think Phil's description of why that is absolutely true. So I totally agree with him. Now, obviously, okay, well, what God is doing, he's not determining that King Ahab will be deceived. He does have this categorical ability to, believe or not, or to listen to the lying spirit or not, and that sort of thing. But it's the way God knows, the way he's guaranteeing what the future will be is through his middle knowledge, right? He knows what King Ahab would freely choose to do. And I'm kind of simplifying this because I don't actually believe we can choose our beliefs necessarily directly and stuff. But getting away from that, he is still having his libertarian free will. And that is ultimately what is responsible for his believing this lying spirit. God in no way is determining this person. The lying spirit is not determining King Ahab's listening to this person and that sort of thing. So, yeah, it's God's middle knowledge. He knows what King Ahab would freely choose to do in this circumstance, and he's using that knowledge to predict in advance and tell in advance what he's going to choose to do, but that's not determining what he does. So yeah, because
knowledge is not causal, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Gotcha. Phil, would you like to comment on that too?
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, the fact that something will occur does not necessarily mean that it will necessarily occur.
Okay.
And this is one of the things that we have to point out when we're dealing with Calvinism, is that I've heard Calvinists, my tongue is getting tied, sorry. I've heard Calvinists tell me that whatever will happen must necessarily happen. And my response is that that's a fallacy. The fact that something will happen does not mean that it was necessary. It could mean that it's inevitable, but even inevitability and necessity are not the same thing. And in the book, I point out that our sin is an example of the difference between necessity and inevitability. We have a sin nature now that we are fallen human beings. After the fall, we all have a sin nature. But that does not mean that our sin, that every individual sin is necessary. It means that some sin is going to be inevitable on our part. So we will sin, but we will not necessarily sin. We don't sin by necessity, we sin by nature. And the fact that our nature leads us to sin does not mean that we could not have done otherwise. So when it says, you shall persuade him and prevail, God is telling the lying spirit, you're going to be successful. And God knows ahead of time. So God's saying, I know what's going to happen, and I'm telling you now, you're going to be successful. This will happen. Ahab is going to be convinced of the fact that he's going to prevail against Ramoth Gilead. And so my response is that simply is not true. It's not a necessity that he will do that, because, like you said, Tyler, God's knowledge is not causal. But the other thing that I want to point out is sometimes we don't see the word persuade in here. Because if this was something where Ahab was determined to make the choice to attack at Ramoth Gilead, then the word persuade is suddenly incoherent.
Right.
Because to persuade someone is to give them some kind of influence, to influence them in a way that leads them to acquiesce to that influence and be persuaded. So to persuade someone and to determine them are not the same thing. And so if this was a case of determination, then I think the word persuade would not be there. Those two are basically incompatible as far as I'm concerned.
So real quick then, just so I make sure I'm following along, let's go back to necessity and inevitability for just a second. So what you're saying is the difference, and let's just use hypothetical world models since we've already been talking about that a little bit before. So is necessity then, say, something that would indeed happen and will happen in every possible world that could ever exist, and yet inevitability means that whether it's in one world or whether it's in multiple worlds, that's kind of the difference between necessity and inevitability. With necessity, it happens in every possible world because it's necessarily, or it's designed necessarily to happen, where inevitability is that it could happen in this world, even it will happen in this world, but that doesn't necessitate it happening in another possible world. Am I following, or am I way off?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much the drift of it. But
Okay.
I normally don't think and discuss in terms of possible worlds.
Sure.
I don't think it's necessary to necessary. No pun intended. I don't think we have to resort to or appeal to possible worlds in order to expound on the difference between inevitability and necessity.
Sure.
If something will happen and God knows that it will happen, then it is inevitable. But it could have been otherwise. So my definition, and I'm writing my own dictionary as I go here, and I've received certain amount of criticism for that. But
send it to me whenever you publish it.
Okay.
Tyler, I have a couple questions for a thing that I think will help after Phil finishes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, but so real quick, for my definition of inevitability is something that will happen but could have been otherwise. And my definition of necessity is something that could not have been otherwise. Because the basic definition of necessity, and this is not only the philosophical definition, but just the definition that the common definition that is pretty much understood, I think, by most people, and is that when something is necessary, there are no other possibilities.
Yeah. Gotcha.
And that's another way of saying it could not have been otherwise.
So like
there
God,
are no alternatives. There's simply no alternatives involved. It has to be this way, and it can't be any other way.
So like God is necessary then, but his act of creation was just inevitable. Is that fair?
Right. And
Gotcha.
we often draw the contrast between what is what is necessary and what is contingent. So we could put inevitability in the category of contingency.
Gotcha.
Because creation is contingent, God is necessary. Creation, the created world does not have to exist. God did not have to create. So it could possibly not exist. God could possibly not have created. But God cannot possibly not exist. So he is a necessary being. His existence is necessary.
Gotcha.
And so whenever we see verses like this, we have to realize that the fact that the Bible says that something will happen and that God knows that it will happen That doesn't mean it will necessarily happen. We have to make sure we don't make that mistake of thinking that it's going to be necessary if it will happen. And it is such a common mistake that I think it's worth discussing frequently, loud and long. That inevitability and necessity are not the same thing. And so every time the Bible says something will happen, we have to make sure we discipline our minds to avoid coming to the conclusion that it was necessary. That's simply not the case. So.
Gotcha. Oh, I do want to turn it over to Del for our audience, just real quick, Del. I promise I'll give over to you.
No problem.
If you're just tuning in, so we are going a little bit deeper. I saw a comment by Stizu W. Forgive me if I mispronounced that, but what's up? Say that again, Del.
I was just saying, he's a new one. I haven't heard his name
Yeah.
before, so.
Yeah. So if you're just catching this, I suggest going back. Like if you're just tuning in, going back, wait until we're over. Hang out with us if you'd like, but definitely go back and get the introduction to this video, because we're going a lot deeper. We're talking about theological determinism. We're talking about libertarian free will, and within this category of or question, I should say, of can God lie? So it's not as simple as just answering that question, even though it's dealing with the metaphysical possibility and logical possibility of God lying. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to our audience that's just tuning in. But Del, I give it over to you, brother.
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing, before I get to the question, this will help. This is the way I understand logical necessity in terms of logical possible worlds, metaphysically necessary. And the third category is something can be factually necessary. So what we're saying, so when we say something is logically necessary, we're saying, look, given the laws of logic are true, that antecedent is true, then X, Y, or Z is necessary to occur. So that's when we say something's logically necessary, that's in a sense, what we're saying is that given the laws of logic, if the laws of logic are true in that world, then whatever X will also be true. And because the laws of logic are true in every logically possible world, that's the definition of it, then you would say, okay, if something is logically necessary, then it exists or is true in every single logically possible world. Now, here's where I may have a difference with Phil, and I wanted to get his take, because then under that, there's a subset of worlds that we call metaphysically possible worlds. Those are a subset of all the logically possible worlds. So it's a smaller number of worlds that are actually feasible. And basically, we're just saying, well, given some kind of metaphysical, ontological antecedent, such as my actually existing with my will, then it's necessary that X, Y, or Z would obtain. And with factual necessity, basically we're appealing to certain facts of a given world. So we're talking about, for example, the laws of nature, right? So given we exist in this universe and it operates the way it does, those facts on the ground, then if I drop a pen, it's guaranteed to fall or something like that. So that's the way that I define those. And each is a subset. So logically possible worlds is the biggest set. Then there's the feasible or metaphysical subset, which is a smaller set. My understanding is Phil was almost kind of saying the opposite, because he said it's metaphysically possible God can lie. So I want to get his take on that. But there's also underneath that, there's these factually possible worlds, or this factual world, I guess if there's only one universe or something like that, that exists, and that's just describes the facts in our actual universe and stuff. But yeah, Phil, my first question for you is, you mentioned that you think it is it's logically impossible for God to lie, but metaphysically speaking, nothing is impossible. So were you saying that he could, metaphysically speaking, lie in some way?
No.
Okay.
Because for me, and we may have a different concept of what's metaphysically impossible. I think that it's kind of a difficult concept. It's a little bit abstract, and for to say that something is metaphysically impossible, that to me that speaks to God's omnipotence. So nothing is too difficult for God, and to me that speaks to metaphysical impossibility. But if something is logically impossible, it is automatically metaphysically impossible. And so I think there's a subordinate relationship if we want to talk about metaphysical impossibility and logical impossibility. If something is metaphysically possible or metaphysically impossible, that it's not necessarily logically impossible. But if something is logically impossible, I think that it means that it's necessarily metaphysically impossible as well. God is not going to be capable or able to do something that his nature forbids. And so if it's logically impossible for God to lie, I think we can say that it's automatically metaphysically impossible for God to lie as well. But that depends on our definition of metaphysical possibility, and that's a very it's kind of nebulous, it's kind of abstract, it's a little bit difficult for me to define that. I think of it as, and instead of I'm going to take the prefix meta off, and I'm going to say, is it something physically possible for God? In other words, can God lift a 2-ton rock? No, nothing is impossible, or nothing is too difficult for God, so he can lift a 2-ton rock with no problem. And it is not logically incoherent for God to lift a 2-ton rock. So therefore, we can entertain the possibility that it's metaphysically or physically possible for God to lift a 2-ton rock. So that's kind of where I put things. But this subordinate relationship between logical possibility and metaphysical impossibility, it might not fit every definition of metaphysical impossibility. So it would probably depend on how you define that. And I find it very difficult to define. I had this idea in my head, but it's kind of like time. I have an idea of what time is in my head, but it's really hard for me to describe it.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it sounds to me we are exactly on the same page. Like, I guess metaphysical, we could use Elvin Planting as broad logical possibility, and that kind of covers both of what we were saying. But you do have the right relationship kind of thing. Like, logical possible worlds is kind of the biggest, is the set, and then there's metaphysical is kind of a subset of that, and then we could have physical or factual worlds or whatever, and that's kind of under the metaphysical thing. So okay, so that's great, we're on the same. The other thing I wanted to ask is the reason you said it's logically impossible because you think you can't make a choice that contradicts your nature. Now I just wanted to ask you though, but there are clearly beings that are able, with their categorical ability, such as human beings, like we didn't have a sin nature before the fall, and we did choose to go against our own nature. Or same with Lucifer and the angels up there, they made a choice that contradicted their nature. It wasn't in their nature to be sinners. So I just wanted you to kind of clarify that for me a bit, if that's okay.
Yeah, and there's another slide where you mentioned that, and maybe we could
do you remember?
Oh well, it doesn't matter. Yeah. So here's the kind of the conclusion that I want to talk about. And let me start with the conclusion, and then let's try to unpack a little bit. And I think you would be able to help me do that. The conclusion is the overall principle that I want to elaborate on is that not having a sin nature and having a morally perfect nature are not the same thing. You know what I mean? Let me say that again. Not having a sin nature and having a morally perfect nature are not the same thing. God has a morally perfect nature, but human beings who are created and exist before the fall do not have the same morally perfect nature that God does. In order to have a morally perfect nature, you have to be God, or you have to be, you have to have a divine nature given to you. And in my opinion, this is, I'm giving you my opinion now, and I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. But in my opinion, Adam and Eve had a morally neutral nature. They did not have a sin nature, but they did not have a morally perfect nature. And there were two possibilities in the Garden of Eden. One was that they would eat from the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and therefore the fall would occur. The other possibility was that they would eat of the tree of life, and that the fall would not occur, and that they would be given divine life and given a divine nature, in which case they would no longer have the possibility of a sin nature. So, but before the fall, Adam and Eve had a nature that could have gone one way or the other. They had a nature that could have assumed a sin nature, and they had a nature that could have assumed a divine nature that allowed them to, so it allowed them so that it was not logically possible for them to sin. But before the fall, it was logically possible for them to sin. They did not have a perfect moral nature, because if they did, they would not have been able to sin. So I always try to differentiate between being sinless and not having a sin nature and having a morally perfect nature. I think we needed to separate those two things and not call them the same thing. So they were not morally perfect. They were simply, they were not guilty. They were not guilty of sin. They did not sin. They had not committed any sin. But that doesn't mean that they did not have a nature that allowed for the possibility that they could sin. So that's a fundamental difference between man's nature at creation before the fall and God's morally perfect nature. Those two natures are not identical.
Gotcha. Yep, that makes sense to me as an answer. So, all right, perfect. Yeah, I guess I have I've raised kind of fundamentally two objections against this notion of God's being morally determined. The first of which was kind of a philosophical one, that it kind of, look, in order to be morally praiseworthy versus blameworthy, you do need this categorical ability to do other than you do, or at the least to refrain, to will to do as you do. And if God's morally determined, he, by necessity, he lacks that categorical ability. So how can he be morally praiseworthy, or does it diminish his moral praiseworthiness if he's determined to do what he does anyways?
Yeah. Well, I always get a little nervous when we start talking about God being determined by his own nature, because the word determined has some baggage that can sometimes come along for the ride, that I think can lead us astray if we're not careful. Because when we say that human beings are determined, what we're saying is that we're determined by something other than someone or something other than ourselves. If we say that God is determined, we're not saying that he is determined by something other than himself, something or someone other than himself, because there is nothing behind God. There's no reality in back of God. You can't peel God away like a curtain and find something behind him. There's no reality above or behind God. So if God is determined, that's different than saying that human beings are determined. And the other thing that I want to point out is that that God may be morally determined, but that doesn't necessarily, by his own nature, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he is metaphysically determined, that all of his choices are determined, because God makes choices that are not moral in nature. When God made the choice to create the universe, that was not a moral decision. It wasn't a moral choice. And so that, therefore, God has libertarian freedom in the sense that he made a choice that was amoral, that had no moral consequences or no moral attributes to it. And in that sense, we can say that God has libertarian freedom because he can make choices that don't violate his nature, because the choice to create and the choice not to create are morally equivalent. They're both amoral. And so they're both consistent with God's nature. In other words, for God to not create is consistent with his nature, and for God to create is consistent with his nature. So therefore, that decision was not determined by any of his attributes or anything in his nature. And so we can say that God has libertarian free will in the sense that he is not determined by anything other than himself. But if God's moral decisions are determined by his nature, that's not necessarily a problem for his libertarian free will, because if he chooses to do something that violates his moral nature, then that is a logical problem. That's a logical contradiction. That's far worse than the possibility that some form of his free will is somehow bruised by the fact that he is determined by his morally perfect nature. Think of the consequences that would occur if God could actually violate his own moral nature. Those problems are vast. They actually completely destroy the entire framework of Christian theism. So there may be a sense in which it's difficult for understand how God could be determined by his own nature, and I want to use the word determined in an extremely limited sense. That the problems that we encounter because of that are not showstoppers, and they don't indicate that God does not have libertarian freedom. So I don't know if it helps or not, but if you define libertarian freedom as the categorical ability to do otherwise, the categorical ability to sin or to do something that is morally defective, if that's the case, then you could say that God does not have libertarian free will in that particular logical moment, in that particular category, in that aspect, in that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't have libertarian free will in general, overall, as far as his entire nature and as far as his entire range of possibilities that he can choose. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, and if it's not, then let me know how it's not, and possibly we might be able to refine it a little bit, that's more helpful.
Hey Dale, can I jump in just for a second? Just
Sure.
for our audience sake. We are going to be taking audience questions for everyone's information. So if you would like to post a question, I'm already seeing a whole lot of them in the comments. And by the way, I had to step away for just a second, but I was listening to y'all, and so that was really good points, Phil. I think that you were making, especially distinguishing between the natures, like Adam and Eve had. Did they have a nature? Was this the difference between a morally perfect nature and a nature that's not able to sin, or that it isn't? It hasn't sinned yet anyway. I think that was brilliant, and agree with you on that. But to the point of the audience, we are taking audience questions. If you would like your question 100% addressed, because I don't know if we can get to all of them, send us a super chat and we will make sure that your question takes priority over the rest. But Dale, over to you, brother. Good conversation so far, guys. It's awesome.
Yeah, this is helpful. Yeah, so the first thing I want to say is hallelujah. Thank you, Phil, because I agree with you that even if God is morally determined, that doesn't negate the fact that he does have a categorical ability and is a libertarian free will agent in other aspects or other respects. I would technically disagree with you on the issue of creation, though. I have a slight different take. So I think that creation was a libertarian free will choice. God had a categorical ability. But I do think that creation was a moral decision, because the creation of moral agents is by necessity a moral decision on God's part. Plus, he's making choices about our eternal destinies as sentient beings and stuff like that. But the way I kind of handle that, if you're interested, if it's not off topic, but as to why is it a free choice for God? It's based on the ultimate value that, all things considered, the actual world, where God chooses to create this world, where as many free will creatures as possible choose salvation versus damnation, that has an equal overall value to the world where God just exists alone. He doesn't create. And
I would like to have that conversation with you, Dale, one of these days, because I actually disagree with that. But go ahead. I don't want to derail.
Sure. So that's just a subtle difference. That's how I kind of say, well, God still had a categorical ability, and he was a libertarian free will agent with respect to creating versus not creating. But I would say it was a moral decision. So, and that sort of thing, right? So there could be, his nature was playing a morally determining role, but it was just, it determined he can't create some worlds that have lesser value, for example. But that's a minor thing. Okay, so I like your answer. Okay, so with creatures,
So can I comment on that?
of course, yeah.
So are we saying that, or are you saying, Dale, that God's decision to create the universe was morally necessary? In other words, did his moral nature determine him to create the universe? And if he did not create the universe, would that have been a morally blameworthy decision?
So because they have equal overall values, his moral nature didn't determine that he create or not create. But I would say, for sake, there are some possible worlds that have a lesser value. In that case, his moral nature would have to determine him not to create those worlds. He didn't have the ability to create those worlds. Also, if there were, I don't think there is, but if there were hypothetically some world that had an overall value greater than the world where God just exists alone, that would make it necessary that God create that world, morally necessary. God create that world, and he would have been determined. But the only way I get out of that is by saying that the actual world that he created, it has an overall equal value to the world where God just exists alone. And in that sense, he's not determined in any way. He's free to choose. Do I want to create this world or not? Oh, I stumped him. Okay. I wasn't that. Oh, sorry.
No. What's happening, Dale, is that you're cutting in and out. So whenever I don't hear you, I don't know whether it's because you're not talking or whether it's because you're talking and we can't hear you. So
okay, did you hear? How much did you hear of what I said?
I think we heard most of it, but I think I understand what you're saying. But the problem that I have is that if the decision to create was a moral decision, then it had to have been a decision that was derived from God's morally perfect nature. It could not have been an immoral decision, so to speak. It could not have been a decision that violated his moral nature.
Right.
So if God's decision to create was a morally praiseworthy decision, then it follows that his decision not to create was a morally blameworthy decision. That it was so. I think to say that God's decision to create was a moral one, I think it lands us in a soup of problems that I'm not sure that we can solve for ourselves. So, and I think to say that God created moral beings means that his decision to create was a moral one, I'm not sure that follows. I think I disagree with that conclusion.
Sure.
Because I think that commits the fallacy of composition, and which says that if part of a car is made of metal, the whole car must be made of metal. And so the fact that the outcome of God's creation has moral attributes doesn't mean that the decision to create has the same moral attributes, or has moral attributes because of the fact that the creation has moral attributes, that beings in creation are moral beings. So I think I disagree with that one, but I might not be understanding perfectly. So if there's some clarification, then I'd be happy to hear it. So.
Yeah, well, I guess so. It's in terms of the decision. It's neutral, I guess you could say, in terms of the morality of making the choice between, actualizing the most value. It's equal, because I'm saying that it's equal between God not creating and just existing alone and this world. However, there is an aspect that philosopher. This is what I wrote my master's MRP on, about why a good God could create, but an evil God couldn't. And there is this aspect of, okay, if it's not about maximizing value, there is a morally praiseworthy aspect in the fact that the good God, by creating, is being other-centered, is what Carlo Alvaro would argue and stuff. So I could make that argument that there is still an element of moral praiseworthiness going into it, even though it's not meaning, oh, well, there's a greater moral value or something like that, or a greater overall value of creating versus not creating. So yeah, and I take your point about the fallacy composition, but yeah, I don't think that's what I'm doing. I think that it is a moral. I mean, how we treat moral agents is itself a moral decision. I don't think I'm just saying, well, because there's morality in the universe, creating the universe as a whole is a moral decision. It's, I mean, the entire purpose of the universe is, to my understanding biblically, is instrumental in bringing about God's ultimate goal for creating, which is bringing as many free will creatures as possible into that salvific state, that final state where they're in an eternal loving relationship. And I think that was God's motivating reason for creating, and that is a moral one in nature. But yeah, you can get less.
And you know what, Dale? It just occurred to me that I think I might have committed a fallacy myself a few minutes ago.
Okay.
So I think I need to correct that, because I said that if the decision to create was a moral decision, there had moral attributes, and that it was morally praiseworthy, then the decision not to create would be morally blameworthy, and that's a fallacy. That was a mistake on my part. Gotcha. Because that what I committed is called the negative inference fallacy. And that fallacy is that if God's creation, if that choice was morally praiseworthy, if it was a moral choice, that the decision not to create would be an immoral one. That doesn't follow. That's I think I just committed the negative inference fallacy at that point. So it's
that's cool.
So my objection to the fact that God's creation was a moral decision, I think that objection fails. So, but I still hold the possibility that decision was not a moral decision.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be a moral decision. It might not be a moral decision. I don't think it's necessarily a moral decision. I think that's probably the best way to put it. Because let's think of it this way: if all of God's decisions are moral decisions and have moral implications, then all of his decisions would be determined because any moral decision that God makes must be determined by his moral nature. So if that's the case, then God would not have libertarian free will if there's no such thing as a decision that God makes that is not moral in nature. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I'm far from you may be entirely right about that and stuff. Maybe the creation is not a moral thing, but I definitely agree with your fundamental point is that not every choice that God makes is a moral one, and I 100% agree on that front. So
Yeah,
okay.
we can leave the is creation a moral choice? We can leave that question hanging, and we can just say we don't necessarily have to commit to one side or the other of that question. You know.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So here's my other question that is essential to your point, and I think it helps me, but I still have a further issue that I want to ask. So you kind of contrasted the mere sinless creatures and stuff, and it's a contingent property for them, and or if anything, they're determined externally. You said versus with God, it's an internal or his internal nature is determining him, and that's just as morally praiseworthy as anything. Now, first of all, I wanted to ask you. I'm not sure about this because again, if we ask the further question, okay, well, why does God have the nature that he has? If that's just what he has versus was that a choice on his part? Can he, did he choose to have that nature? Can he choose to not have that nature? It almost seems like it would be morally praiseworthy if God had the morally perfect nature that he had, that property of moral perfection as a choice. He had a categorical ability, and he just never chooses to actualize the thing where he had a different nature or he contradicts or violates his nature and stuff like that. That isn't there a praiseworthiness in that? Look, I could have been different, but I chose the nature, and that's determining all my actions. It's kind of like Roman Catholics, I think, have this belief that with human beings, they become once they go up to heaven, they kind of their moral state crystallizes, so they become like God. They're determined morally. They can never sin in God's presence, but it makes sense because on earth they chose to have that state be crystallized in all of eternity, and that's a praiseworthy thing of human beings. So wouldn't it be the same with God if almost somehow he had the ability to be otherwise, but he chose his nature, and now his nature determines all of his subsequent moral actions. But that obviously doesn't apply to God. Like he just is essentially what he is. So there's like a diminished praiseworthiness. I don't know what your response is for that.
Yeah, I think we can both agree. The short answer is no.
Okay.
I think we can both agree that God did not choose his own nature.
Yeah.
Because you have to have a nature in order to make a choice. So to choose one's own nature is circular. It's logically incoherent. So God did not choose his own nature. God's nature is his nature, period. And the choices that he makes are derived from his nature. There cannot be any choice that is not derived from one's can make a choice that is incompatible with his own nature. So that means that God could not. Let me put it another way. If God could choose his own nature, then he could choose a morally imperfect nature, and he could be a morally imperfect God. And if that's the case, then God's nature is suddenly contingent, isn't it? It's no longer necessary. So God's moral perfection is no longer necessary if he chose that morally perfect nature.
Gotcha.
And I think that's going to land us in another soup that we're going to drown in if we say that God's nature is contingent. God's nature cannot be contingent. It must be necessary, just like his existence. Every attribute of God is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So,
go ahead.
so I think that's the best answer I could give you on that.
And that was the perfect
and
answer. That,
and the fact that God did not choose a morally perfect nature, I don't think that diminishes the moral praiseworthiness of God's nature. The choice to be morally perfect could be a praiseworthy choice, a morally praiseworthy choice. But the fact that choice doesn't exist means that whether it's morally praiseworthy or not is pretty much irrelevant.
Gotcha. Yeah, so that makes total sense. You actually hit the nail on the head there. You're right. It doesn't make any sense to say, could God have chosen a morally imperfect nature?
Right.
It's just a matter of okay, well, could he choose to ever violate the nature that he had, the morally perfect nature that he has? But that leads to logical contradictions and stuff like that.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
does that solve the problem? Because it seemed like you had some qualms there about whether whether we can give credit for God, we can give credit to God for having a morally praiseworthy nature, a morally perfect nature. It seemed like that was a little bit of a stumbling block for you. And so did that clarification remove the stumbling block for you? That's my question.
I think it did. I'm going to go back and re-listen to it, but at least on the spot, I think you did. Now I'm having what's arising is a different problem now. So if this scenario works,
Stop it,
That's the
Dale.
way it goes, man.
like, sorry,
Dale, you just need to quit while you're ahead. Stop all these.
okay. Well, I'm just wondering now. So looking at the human perspective, then, if this works for God, it should work for humans. Compatibilism, it does have a way of making people morally praiseworthy versus blameworthy because they're being determined by their own internal natures and stuff like that. So why would we insist that no, you can't be morally praiseworthy or blameworthy without a categorical ability for humans then?
Well, I think our choices are morally praiseworthy and blameworthy based on the moral categories of our choices.
Okay.
But man's nature is contingent. We always have to keep that in mind. So we can't say that man is the same way when we talk about whether or not our decisions are determined by our nature. Because the only way that our decisions could be determined by our natures is if our natures were perfect. So I think if we want to say that man is determined by his own moral nature, just like God is, I think that's kind of a problem. Now, that doesn't mean that that if our nature isn't perfect, that we have to be determined by something other than ourselves. So I think what I said could have been a little bit confusing. So I want to clear that up a little bit. But man's moral nature is such as it is what leads him to the decisions that he makes, and all the decisions that man makes are within his moral nature. But his moral nature is contingent, which means that we don't have a morally perfect nature, and therefore there is the possibility, the potential for us to sin. So I don't know if that was helpful or not, but I think that some of the ways that I put it were a little confusing for a second there. So
Yeah.
Tell me how that.
So that one's not working as well for me. I do need to rethink about it because I don't see the fact that people are contingent or that you have like what's this principle that you have to, in order to be determined by your nature, it has to be perfect. Why would that be the case? Yeah.
Actually that was a confusing thing to say. That I need to retract that. What I was trying to say is that that if we are determined by our own nature, then that since that nature is contingent, then whatever choices we make are contingent choices and could have been otherwise. So
Okay.
Does that help a little bit? I mean, this is an extremely nebulous area to be in. It's and a lot of times whenever we talk about determinism and indeterminism, there's always an element of mystery here. There's some things about this that it's very difficult for us to understand. But I think we have to be able to say that our nature is contingent and our choices are contingent. God's nature is not contingent. And therefore, the decisions that he makes are always perfect. They're always praiseworthy. That we cannot criticize God for any decisions that he makes. But when you talked about man being identical to God in a certain respect, I want to get what you meant by that, because I'm not sure that I did.
But well, I was just saying, like, if it is morally praiseworthy for God to make a choice via being determined, but from his internal moral nature, well, compatibilists, on the other hand, they say the same thing about, well, that's what humans do. Their supposition is that based on certain internal factors like their natures and their beliefs and desires, this determines what choice they will make, and that sort of thing. So in that sense, pretend the external things just play the role of influences for the sake of argument. They're not really, well, I guess they're determining what your nature is and all this stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I see your problem. Let me see if I can state your problem and the problem that you're raising, and then you tell me whether or not I'm understanding it. If a choice is determined, then what we're saying as indeterminists is, and non-compatibilists is, if a choice is determined, one cannot be blamed for a choice that is determined and is a morally defective choice. And so if something is determined, we say it's that we're not responsible. If
Exactly.
our choices are determined, we're not responsible.
Exactly.
And we cannot be praised or blamed for our choices if they are determined.
Yes, exactly.
And I think the problem that you're raising is that if God's choices are determined, then doesn't that remove the praiseworthiness or blameworthiness of God's choices as well?
Beautiful. Yep. You
Is
should argue my position. You did a better job than me of phrasing it. But yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting. What I was trying.
Okay, so that's the problem you're raising. Yeah. And I think the answer to that dilemma is that God's choices, even if his moral choices are determined by his own nature, that nature is morally perfect. And so it is praiseworthy because it is a morally perfect choice, because it came from his morally perfect nature. So the fact that something is determined is only a problem for praiseworthiness and blameworthiness when that being that made that decision is contingent. I think that's where the difference lies, is that God is not contingent, and therefore he does not have the problem of his morally determined choices being not praiseworthy or blameworthy. God doesn't have that problem because he's not contingent. I think we have that problem because we are contingent. So
Gotcha.
tell me if that dog will hunt.
It does. That makes sense to me and stuff. I obviously want to reflect on it and stuff like that. But yeah, what you're laying down, I'm kind of buying at this point. So yeah, I think I'm happy with that.
I think that's only scratches the surface. We could spend weeks on that problem and on that issue, but I don't think the problem is unsolvable. So,
hey guys, can I jump in real quick? Because we have a kind of, I think anyway, an important audience question that Country Dad posed, and I just want to get your all's view on that. And then y'all, I have got to bounce in 20 minutes, and so if y'all want, I've got to go to a Christmas play with my wife that I promised her I'd go to, so I can't send and lie to her and not go.
Where
But
are your priorities, mister?
I know it, right? Like, she needs to understand that this is my domain and my throne, and I have to be here. But anyway, so let's, if y'all want to, Dale, since you don't have hosting abilities, do we want to just end in 20 minutes and maybe we could do a part 2 on this, and then get into some audience questions, or what do you want to do, bro?
Yeah, okay, so how about this? Let me, because I just had one last objection. So
Sure.
let me just hear Phil's answer to that, and then we can, sorry, do the Q&As.
Sure.
And obviously, if you want to do a part 2, you basically seen what my things are, anyways. But yeah, the one issue I just want to hear Phil's answer on, so I can, is this issue of genuine temptation of Jesus. Like,
Yes.
yeah, I mean,
Ooh,
look,
that's good stuff.
he knew he was morally determined. There was no real temptation. He may have been feeling a desire at a certain point. Sure, I can grant that. But in the end, it's not the same if there's a genuine possibility you might fall prey to that temptation. Jesus would have known, okay, I'm feeling it now, but I know for a fact I'm not going to fall. I'm not going to make that choice to sin. That's not a genuine temptation. I think that knowing about that possibility that you might thing is a part of having a genuine temptation to sin. So yeah, what's your take on that, Phil?
I've never really thought about this before you brought it up. So I want to give you huge accolades for bringing up this point. I've never thought about this before. I've never thought, is it a real temptation if Jesus does not have a nature that will allow him to give into that temptation? And one of the first ideas that popped into my head when I started thinking about this was that a temptation there can be different kinds of temptations. There can be a temptation that is designed to get someone to do something wrong. But there can also be a temptation that is designed to test the moral nature of the one being tempted. So a temptation can be can be somehow influential, or it can be somehow an exposure of the nature of the one being tempted. And I think that the better way to put this is that Jesus was tested in the wilderness. His moral character was being put to the test. And when you put someone's moral nature to the test and you try to get them to sin and they don't sin, then they have passed the test and they have demonstrated that their moral nature is not going to lead them to sin. So I don't know if that's very helpful or not, but that was the first idea that I had in my mind, because here comes Jesus, and the devil says, if you are the Son of God, if you really are the Son of God, the way that you claim to be, or the way that that is being made apparent to us, then I'm going to test you, and I'm going to see, are you really who you claim to be? Is your identity really what you present and what is being presented to us about you? And so that's where the temptation lies. I think the temptation is a matter of testing who Jesus is, not necessarily trying to get him to sin. And if he can't sin, then that's not a real temptation. I don't think that's a valid conclusion. I think if the temptation is a test to see if God, or that if Jesus really is the Son of God, that he really does have the nature that he has, I think that can be a genuine temptation, because it's a genuine test. It's a genuine way of determining, not in the deterministic sense, but a genuine way of discovering whether or not his identity really is what he claims it to be, and whether his nature really is what his identity would say that it is. and I'm not doing a very good job of explaining this, but does that initial idea help any?
I think it does, yeah, because I had never considered different types of temptations, or like, a test is a type of temptation, but there might be different stuff, so different versions of temptation. So yeah, that's something I never thought of and stuff. So I'll definitely take that back and consider it.
There are some translations of the Bible that say that the devil led Jesus into the wilderness in order to test him. And I think that's an extremely revealing translation, because I think the translators knew that that there was an element of testing in what occurred, and so I think, to me, that was very helpful. It was very helpful for me to see those translations and to say, yeah, Jesus being tested, and so yeah, that was good for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that would totally solve it. And I know Tyler knows the Greek and stuff, but yeah, Tyler, I'll give it back to you because I know we have audience questions and stuff as well. So
yeah. So let's jump into the audience questions. We're still taking audience questions. Excuse me. If y'all would, if you still got an audience question for these guys, please put at Faith Unaltered in the chat, or if you're commenting on Real Seekers, put at Real Seekers in the chat so I can see. And please let us know who your question is for. If you don't put who your question is for, I'm going to assume that it's for both of these guys, and we'll get both of their takes on it. But if you have a specific question for a specific member, Dale or Phil, then please put who that question is for. And so the first question we got here is we've got a lot from Country Dad and a couple from CZW. So again, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, and we'll go from there. But anyway, so let's get to the first one here. Country Dad, why don't you guys just use the scriptures to prove what you're saying?
For me,
it's for both. I'm
okay.
guessing. So Dale, if you want to jump on
my
it.
My answer is I did. That was my first slide. I don't know if you saw that, but why can't we use the scriptures to solve this question totally? I think it only provides a partial answer. It's underdeterminative. So for example, we have the Hebrews text saying that it's impossible for God to lie. Well, there's that further philosophical question. Well, what does that mean? Is it metaphysically impossible? Is it logically impossible? Like what exactly is it saying when it's impossible? So the scriptures give us a good foundation, but I think they're underdeterminative. We need logic and philosophical reasoning to kind of spell things out a little bit more and stuff like that. So that would be my answer.
Phil?
First of all, the Bible does not tell us everything. The Bible only tells us everything we need to know. There are some theological principles and formulas that say that the Bible gives us everything for life and godliness. And so if there is an answer that the Bible does not give us, then that means that we don't need to know that answer. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't explore that answer, because exploring all of these things glorifies God, and that's our ultimate purpose, is to glorify God by exploring these ideas. The second thing is that there are two ways that a Christian can prove something true or false. You can either use the scriptures to prove something true or false, but if the scriptures don't give you specific data that will help you prove it false or true or false, then there has to be other means of proving things true or false. And the other means, besides just appealing directly to scripture to prove something true or false, is to use logical reasoning. Mm-hmm. So as Christians, we use both. We use the scriptures in order to give us truth, but we also use logical reasoning to give us truth. And there are people who will object to that and say, well, you're using human reasoning in order to try to prove some kind of divine principle. And my response to that is, that potential objection, is that logic, the laws of logic that govern the truth values of all propositions, those are grounded in the mind of God. That is grounded in the divine logos, because the word logic is derived from the Greek word for logos. So the logos of God is what determines the laws of logic. It's where the laws of logic come from. And so if we are reasoning based on the laws of logic in order to prove that a given proposition is true or false, then what we are doing is we are conforming to the divine logos. We are being subordinate to the divine logos by using those rules of reasoning. So that's why we don't use the scriptures to prove everything that we're saying. We use logic to prove some of the things that we're saying. And we can follow that example from scripture because Jesus himself used the laws of logic. He used logical arguments against the Pharisees when they challenged him. And then Paul used logical arguments all over the place. And we can actually categorize the logical arguments that Paul used. He used the modus ponens, categorical or conditional syllogism. He used the modus tollens conditional syllogism. Paul was using syllogisms all over the place in the New Testament. And the New Testament can actually be a textbook in logic because you can find all these logical arguments and logical deductions in the New Testament, and what Paul is saying, what Peter is saying, and what John is saying. So that's kind of the reason why we don't always use the scriptures to prove what we're saying.
Sorry, go ahead.
What we're doing, what we're doing when we prove some things without using scripture, we are still honoring God because we are following his divine logos when we do that.
I would agree with what Phil just said. The majority of what you just said. There's a couple things in there I'd be like, let's push back a little bit. But I will say, whenever you also look at the church fathers, you look at the tradition of the church, you see what you're talking about, Phil, and what you was talking about, Dale. You see this idea of not only Paul, but Christians throughout the last 2,000 years using philosophical arguments to prove their points, right? Not everything is just look at scripture, because someone in the comments made a very, very good, what's the word I'm looking for? Point, I guess, for lack of better words. Because, everybody, think about it. We had a whole bunch of different people that we all would disagree with on this channel and on Real Seekers that go straight to the Bible to prove their point. And yet what we see is just because you don't go to the Bible doesn't necessarily mean that your point is proven. If you contradict other parts of scripture by isolating passages of scripture, all of these different things can show. And that's philosophy, by the way. If you don't take both hand in hand, philosophy and theology, I think you get to heresy really, really quickly. And we've seen that happen, especially with our episode last night with a certain person coming on and say, well, I don't like philosophy, this, that, and the other, and yet doing philosophy while he's arguing against philosophy. It's just weird to me. And so, yes, I agree with what both you said. We have to use scriptures, but if we can't use scriptures, we definitely go to the philosophical claims. So
what is the same philosophy as the handmaiden of theology?
Right. Very much so. And you see this tradition happen over and over and over again in the church fathers and even in the Bible itself. And so I agree with both of you there. All right. So our next question comes from Sisu W. They, meaning, I believe, Adam and Eve, willed to sin before the fall. How did they sin if they did not have a sin nature? And Phil, I'll let you go first on this one, and then Dale.
Well, I think I would just repeat what we observed earlier, and I think what we're all on the same page on earlier, is that you don't have to have a sin nature in order to sin. You only have to have a contingent nature in order to sin. So, and the other aspect of that is that if man truly has libertarian freedom, and I believe that he does, I believe in what I would call exhaustive libertarian freedom. And that means that none of our choices are determined by external or antecedent necessity. But if we have libertarian freedom, then we have to be, as contingent beings, we have to be able to sin, because if we can't, then all of our decisions our moral decisions are determined, and if they're determined, then they have no consequences for us. So I think that's the way that we can sin, even if we don't have a sin nature. Having a sin nature is not the only kind of nature that allows people to sin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I agree with what Phil was saying in terms of the free will aspect, the categorical ability. We weren't determined, but I guess one thing I'll point out here that I didn't hear from Phil is I think that the sin nature is almost a little bit of a misnomer. Like what we're not talking about nature in the philosophical sense of is it the list of essential properties for a given kind of thing? And no, sin is not an essential property of the human nature. It's something that was acquired contingently after they freely chose to sin. And I think it's more akin to it's referring to a sinful disposition. So it's almost like it's harder for us to make that good choice. We've got like a weight tying down the needle of our compass pointing away from true north, and it's dragging us down. So it takes more effort to choose the good than it did prior to the fall because we inherit this sinful disposition. So yeah.
Right on. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, and then maybe I should have started with this one first, but that's okay. We'll play it out. What is a sin nature? And you guys have answered part of this question before. I think maybe even you've answered all of it. But if there's anything else that you'd like to add, I know Dale just described what a sin nature was, what he meant by that. Phil, how would you answer the question? What exactly is a sin nature?
Well, it is difficult to answer that question, but I like Dale's word disposition. That we have is that the word you use?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I like that word. I don't know that I could describe exactly how that's different from a nature. But to answer the question, did our nature fundamentally change? I think that Dale's comment is extremely helpful. I don't know that our nature fundamentally changed. I think we acquired a new dimension to that nature, and that nature did corrupt our original nature. So I think both are actually true. I think that our nature was altered. It was modified in a certain way, because now it gives us the capacity to sin, or it gives us a disposition to sin and makes our sin inevitable. The original nature that man had before the fall that allowed him to sin did not make his sin necessary. And it might not even have made it inevitable. I'm not sure about that. That would be an interesting question to explore. But I think our nature did change. Whether we can say it fundamentally changed, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that means. I think we could assign different meanings to the word fundamentally. But I think our nature did change, and I think we did acquire additional aspects of that nature. And yes, I think it did become corrupted. So I think both of those are true. I think all of those are true.
Yeah. So. Our nature fell. So therefore it changed in a very real way. And so because, I mean, even in the new heavens and the new earth, like because we won't have an ability to sin doesn't mean we're any less human because of that. Look at Jesus as a prime example of this, right? And so with that being said, I like what you said, Phil. So
yeah.
Good job.
I think just a good way to put it, it would be that before the fall, our nature made sin possible, but it didn't make it inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
After the fall, our sin is not only possible, but it is inevitable. And I think that's what it means to have a sin nature.
Right. Okay. Right on. Dale, is there anything that you'd like to add before we move on to the next question? Or
no, I think I said it well, and I like the way
did.
Phil's laying down. So yeah, I think it was good.
All right. Let's see here. I want to get this off of here. I got a question from our good buddy Jamie. What if the act of saying something untrue isn't the root of the problem? It is the intent or purpose of the one relating to the other person. Question at Faith Unaltered. So Dale, I'll let you go first on this one, and then we'll get Phil.
So yeah, I could agree with this, right? Like obviously there are thought sins and stuff like that, and I think the root of the sin is the intention to commit it and stuff, right? Once you orient your will, is the way I say it, or commit to I will to do this. You could technically be prevented from carrying out the action or something. Let's say you want to punch someone in the face and your arms are tied behind your back. You can't do it, but just the fact that you are orienting your will, you are saying it, I will to do this, that alone could be a sin as well. So if I understand what his question is, I agree that intent and or purposing within your heart is the root of the sin itself. It's the root of the action, that orienting of your will.
And Phil?
Well, my suspicion, and I don't know if I'm correct in this or not, but my suspicion is that this could be a question that is directed toward whether God can sin. Because if God doesn't technically say something that's untrue, but his intention is to mislead or to deceive or to cause someone to hold a false belief, isn't that still a lie, even if he doesn't actually say something that isn't true? And that may be what Jamie has in mind here, and I don't know for sure. But for God, I don't think that it was ever his intent to make someone believe something false. I think God was allowing someone to believe something that was false as an act of judgment, and he knew that the influence that was going to occur would lead to certain consequences, and he ordained or approved of those consequences, that was in line with his will, because he, as an act of judgment, will allow people to believe what is false and to make decisions based on those beliefs. And that the origin, the root of that is never God's intention. The root of that is what God allows, because the root of our sin, the root of our believing things that are false and making decisions that are against his will, that is not rooted in God. That's rooted in our own sinful nature. It's rooted in our own disposition. I love Dale's word there. So if that question was directed toward whether God can lie or not, I think hopefully that will shed a little bit of light on that. So.
Okay. Right on. Thank you both for that. Okay. And then our last question is from Country Kid, and this is a little bit off subject, but that's okay. Where in scripture does it talk about God creating a whole universe? Just curious, still learning. And then Phil, if you want to tackle that one first, and then Dale.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I don't understand what it means to talk about a whole universe as opposed to a partial universe, as opposed to a world that is less than what it could be. I don't know. I'm not sure I understand.
Country Kid, if you could kind of explain what you're talking about in the comments, I'll throw that up to help us out a little bit. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, what he means by that is heaven, like the heavens and the earth. And so everything I would point to, if I think this is right, my interpretation, Country Kid, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would point personally to like Colossians 1:16, for example, where it talks about Jesus creating all things visible and invisible. Tapanta is the Greek there. And what that means is everything, like literally all things, everything. And then Paul goes on to qualify that statement, whether they're thrones or dominions, whether the things invisible or visible. That's what I would consider the whole universe, is everything within this universe: the heavens, the earth, the visible realm, the invisible realm, the tangible, the non-tangible things, all of that stuff. It says specifically in Colossians 1:16, Jesus created these things. Also John 1 John 1:3 is the other place where it said that Christ has created all these things. Isaiah, I don't remember off the top of my head, but if you look through Isaiah 40, chapter 40 through chapter 48, It talks about Yahweh creating everything. He stretches out the heavens.
Isaiah 45, maybe?
Isaiah 45, I think 44 and 45. Psalm 33:6. He creates, and we brought this up on the show last night. But he creates everything by the word of his mouth and by the spirit or breath of his mouth. So all of these different things point to God being creator of everything. And then the New Testament further flushes that out as showing how the Father is working through the Son in the Spirit. This is creation is a Trinitarian energy, I'll say, an action, an operation by the Trinitarian God, by the Triune God, that all three, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, have a part in. And so, Dale, I kind of hijacked it there.
Well,
but
great answer.
Real quickly though, let's go to Country Kid's other comment. He says, "I heard him say something about the universe, and was just curious because it just talks about him creating the earth." And I think that's where the confusion might lie, is that the heavens and the earth, it never clearly speaks of a whole universe. And I think that just by itself, Genesis 1:1 might not necessarily encompass the whole universe, but there's clarification in John 1 where it says nothing that has been made was made was anything that Jesus, that Christ, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, did not make. In other words, there is no such thing as anything in reality that God didn't make.
Right.
And that's kind of where John 1:1 takes us. And so I think John 1:1, it's not John 1:1, it's John 1:3.
Yeah.
I think John chapter 1 helps to clarify and reinforce what Genesis 1:1 says. That it wasn't just something called the heavens and something called the earth, and there's some kind of reality that exists outside of those two categories. All of reality was created by God. There's nothing nothing in contingent reality that wasn't created by him. So I think that's probably one of the best verses that we can use to clarify that.
One thing I'll just quickly add about
that,
because so in addition to what Phil and the verses they're saying, Genesis 1:1 talks about it doesn't use the word universe, but it does speak of the creation of everything in the entire universe. And if you actually get into the ancient Hebrew and how that worked, that is how you interpret that. Now, I don't know the arguments offhand, but if you go to William Lane Craig's his Defenders class, he has an entire Sunday school lecture series on the book of Genesis. I think it's called either The Doctrine of Creation or The Doctrine of Creation and Evolution. And he gets into a lot of detail as to how to interpret the Hebrew of Genesis 1 and the different scholarly ways to evaluate that. I would say Genesis 1:1 isn't just speaking about the earth. It is talking about the creation of the heavens and the earth, the entire universe, space and time, and everything in it. So, look at that. Sorry, I can't give the arguments.
To Country Kid's comment, when Country Kid says it never clearly speaks of a whole universe, I think our answer is that it actually does speak of a whole universe.
Right.
Yeah. Like it doesn't use the word universe, but that's what it's implying if you look at what Hebrew. Yeah.
Well, I would even argue instead of it's a direct statement to Panda in Colossians 1:16 is there is nothing in which Paul is saying that Jesus did not create. And John backs this claim up by stating what Phil had said. There is nothing within all of creation that Jesus did not create. Everything that was created by him. And for him, exactly. Amen. And so with that being said, I think that was good. I think that y'all nailed that. But yeah, I would argue that Ta Panda or Ta Panta, depending on your pronunciation there, is literally saying the entire universe. So visible and invisible. So
there's a comment here. There's a thumbs up by Lynn Berg, and I just wanted to shout out real quick. That's my mother-in-law.
Hey.
So I want to say hi, Lynn. Thanks for listening. I love you. It was great to spend time with you last week, and so I'm glad she's tuned in.
That's awesome. That is great. All right, guys. Well, this has been an absolute blast for me. I have learned a lot. I plan on going back and listening to this. And Dustin Neely, you recommended a book. I'm looking for that book right now. And so I'm excited to dive into St. Simeon, the New Theologian, on that. But thank you all so much. We appreciate our audience. Thank you. I wanted to do a shout out real quick for our audience sake. If there is anything, so I love whenever people pray for me. For those who don't know, I mentioned it last night, and I'll mention it again today. So I am 3 weeks without vaping now because I have decided to put it down. But I had asked for prayers so that people would lift me up in their prayers to God, to ask that if He would, quit or help me quit vaping. That has been successful. So I'm 3 weeks without vaping right now. I'm still doing nicotine patches. And so, I mean, they're not patches, they're pouches. But I have transitioned away from vaping. And so I just want to say thank each and every one of you that has prayed for me on that aspect. And if you would like prayers, we want to do something new. I've been thinking about doing this for a while now, and I wanted to go ahead and make the announcement. If you would like us to pray for you privately, please email me, faithandaltered@gmail.com. And I would be more than willing and happy to pray for anybody that needs it. I truly believe that there is power in prayer. And I think all of us here would say the same thing. And so if you need prayers, or if you just need somebody to talk to about you going through something, hit me up, because I want to be able to offer that to anybody that would want to take advantage of that. And so email me, faithandaltered@gmail.com, if you like prayers, or if you just like to talk about something you're going through. Also, don't forget, we have a debate Tuesday at 6:00 p.m. Central Time, 7:00 Eastern, with Dane Von Ace and Carlos Xavier. Did the New Testament authors identify Jesus as Yahweh? Is the thesis. These guys are going to be debating. Dane is obviously taking the affirmative. Carlos will be taking the negative on that. And I'm moderating. And so this is going to be a really fun debate. I think it's needed. And yeah, that's tune in for that one, because it's going to get exciting. I got a feeling. With that being said, though, guys, any closing words? Phil, we'll start with you. Dell, you can take us out, and then I will end the stream.
I just want to say thank you, and I'm disappointed that we're not going to go for another 2 hours. So we can
I'm sorry. I apologize. It's my
break
fault.
our 4-hour record. I don't think we should plan anything else on a Saturday when we do this.
I agree.
No, thank you so much, Dale. I cherish the thoughts that you have and that you've shared, because I have learned something. I learned several things today from you, Dale, and so I really appreciate you, brother. So.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. Same with me. I mean, I love this. This is my wheelhouse, and I've learned so much from you as well, and stuff. Obviously, in the end, I've learned that you're right. So I've come to the truth, and you're helping me kind of work
God,
out.
I wish more people would say that. Like, you don't ever see that. This is a first, y'all. So Dale, not just Dale, I'm talking about anybody that I've ever seen debate. They never say, "You're right, you win." This is a first. So pin it. Sorry, Dale.
Exactly.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, well, it's got to be truth. I don't see it as win. Like, we've both won, right? Because we've come to God's truth. So, like, yeah, and it was really helpful, kind of making sense, because I still had my residual problem. So, like, okay, I've got a better idea of how to reconcile that with the new truth that I've discovered. So I love this. I'm up for it anytime on any topic you want to do, Phil. If you ever want to do another show in the future. So yeah. That's and next week, Tyler Fowler is a horrible host. He forgot to mention the most important show on Friday on Faith and Real Seekers.
Axiology.
We're having this guest. I don't know if we'd like him, Dale Glover.
I've never heard of that guy.
But yeah, I'll be back on Friday talking about the axiology of theism. When I took my master's in philosophy, my MRP supervisor was a guy named Klaas Cray. I don't know if Phil knows Klaas, but he's world renowned for his work on the axiology of theism. So that's not the question, does God exist or not, but was it valuable for God to exist, or is it more valuable for God not to exist, and that sort of thing. So that's what we'll be covering next week.
Right on. I just
wanted to say real quick, Dale, I humbly appreciate your comments. When you said that you think I'm right about something, it's very dangerous to say that to me because it can easily go to my head.
Oh,
But I always try to emphasize that we want to know what is right and not necessarily who is right. So if you want to say that I was right about something, I would like to put it this way. I spoke the truth about something, and hopefully as Christians we can do that as often as possible, and I want to do it more often. I want to make sure that I am truthful in all things if I possibly can be, and I'm asking God to help me with that. So
absolutely.
Right
Awesome.
on. Well, thank you both. If there's nothing else, then we will go ahead and sign off. Phil, it's been a pleasure. Would love to have you back anytime you would be interested in doing that. Dell, obviously, bro, it's always a pleasure discussing and engaging with you. And so thank you both for coming on. We will see you that next time. Until then, subscribe to both Faith Unaltered and CSG. And until next time, good night, God bless, and stay like Christ.